Changed the day he married my daughter. Not overnight, not dramatically, but in small, confident steps, like a man testing how much space he could take without being challenged. At 74, I had watched people mistake connection for entitlement many times before, but never this close, never under my own roof. The ring on his finger did something to him. It didn't make him family, it made him fearless. The house was quiet that afternoon, filled with clean daylight pouring through tall glass walls. Luxury had a way of amplifying silence, turning every footstep into an announcement. I sat in the living room reading when he walked in, speaking loudly on the phone, laughing, pacing as if the space existed to absorb his confidence. He didn't acknowledge me at first. He didn't have to. In his mind, marriage had already elevated him above courtesy. At dinner later that day, he took control of the table without hesitation. He spoke about plans, about future investments, about how marriage changes priorities. He said things like, "We decide now and our house needs to reflect us." Each word carried assumption, not partnership possession. I listened quietly, observing how naturally he placed himself at the center, how easily he spoke as if the ground beneath us had shifted in his favor. At one point, I offered a small comment about patience, about building stability slowly rather than rushing appearances. It wasn't criticism, it was experience speaking. He looked at me and smiled, then he said it. "Well, things are different now," he replied casually. "I'm part of this family. Decisions don't really need outside approval anymore." Outside, the word hit harder than he intended, or maybe exactly as he intended. The room went still. My daughter froze, her fork hovering midair. She glanced at me, then at him, then looked down. She said nothing. That silence was louder than his words. He noticed it too and mistook it for agreement. I met his eyes calmly. "Marriage doesn't replace respect," I said evenly. He leaned back, unbothered. "I respect you," he replied, smiling thinly. "I just don't think you need to worry about things that don't concern you anymore. Don't concern you anymore." That was the moment I understood the fantasy he was living in. He believed marrying my daughter had placed him beyond correction, beyond accountability, beyond the quiet authority of the man who built the foundation he now stood on. He believed the relationship itself protected him. He believed blood had been replaced by convenience. Conversation moved on without me. He continued speaking, confident, certain, unchallenged. I finished my meal in silence, not because I had been diminished, but because I had seen the full shape of the problem clearly for the first time. After dinner, I excused myself and walked down the long hallway lined with art chosen to impress guests. I closed the door to my room and sat at the desk where a slim leather folder waited untouched for years. I opened it slowly. Inside were documents that didn't care about marriage, charm, or confidence. Deeds, trust records, legal protections written long before he entered our lives. He thought marrying my daughter made him untouchable. He thought family ties replaced accountability. He thought silence meant permission. What he didn't know was that the documents inside that folder had never been influenced by emotion. And when they were finally opened, the fantasy he was living in would end quietly, completely, and permanently, because marriage may offer access, but it never grants ownership, and soon he would learn the difference. After that dinner, his behavior didn't retreat, it expanded. Marriage, in his mind, had not only secured his place in the family, it had rewritten the hierarchy. The house felt different in the days that followed, not because anything physical had changed, but because the way he moved through it did. He walked with certainty now, with the ease of someone who believed every room belonged to him by right. At 74, I had learned that entitlement rarely announces itself loudly at first. It settles in quietly, tests limits, and then spreads when it isn't challenged. Mornings became the clearest example. I woke early as I always had, sunlight already filtering through the glass walls and filling the house with soft brightness. I made my coffee and sat where I always had, watching the property wake up. When he appeared later, he didn't greet me the way he used to. There was no nod, no courtesy. Instead, he went straight into talking on the phone to my daughter, to the space itself, discussing plans, meetings, decisions that had already been made. I wasn't included. I was background. He began referring to things differently. Our schedule, our priorities, what makes sense for us now. Each phrase subtly erased me from the equation. When I spoke, he listened just long enough to appear polite before redirecting the conversation back to himself. It wasn't aggressive, it was efficient. He had decided my role had ended, and efficiency is how people justify dismissal without guilt. My daughter noticed, of course. I saw it in the way she hesitated before speaking, in the way she watched his reactions carefully, choosing words that wouldn't disrupt the fragile balance she was trying to maintain. She had always been thoughtful, always tried to keep peace. But peace, I was beginning to understand, had come at a cost, and I was paying it. One afternoon, he stood in the open living room, speaking loudly on the phone, pacing across marble floors, sunlight catching the shine of his watch. He talked about managing people, about how some individuals don't know when to step aside, about how marriage simplifies things because boundaries become clearer. He didn't lower his voice when he noticed me sitting nearby. He glanced at me briefly, then continued as if I were a piece of furniture. When the call ended, he smiled to himself, satisfied. He believed he was untouchable now. Marriage had given him cover. At dinner that evening, the pattern repeated. He dominated the table, discussing future renovations, lifestyle changes, how the house needed to reflect who we are now. He said it casually, confidently, as if it were a fact no one would question. My daughter shifted in her chair but said nothing. I waited. Silence can be instructive when you want to see how far someone will go. He took it as permission. At one point, he looked at me and said, almost kindly, that marriage changes responsibilities and that people eventually have to accept when their role shifts. His tone suggested wisdom. His words suggested dismissal. I replied calmly that responsibility doesn't disappear just because someone else speaks louder. He smiled thinly, unconcerned. He believed the discussion was over before it began. That was when I realized how deeply he believed the fantasy. He thought marrying my daughter had placed him beyond correction, beyond accountability, beyond the quiet authority earned through years of sacrifice. He believed family ties replaced respect, and that respect was optional once access was secured. He wasn't testing boundaries anymore. He was redefining them. Later that night, my daughter came to my room. She stood near the doorway the way she used to as a child when she knew a conversation would be difficult. Her voice was soft, apologetic. She said he was adjusting, that marriage brought stress, that he didn't mean to exclude me. She said things were changing and she hoped I understood. I told her I did. It was easier than telling her the truth, that understanding didn't mean agreement and silence didn't mean consent. As the days passed, the pressure became more organized. Articles about downsizing appeared on the counter. Casual comments about efficiency and independence slipped into conversation. He spoke about long-term planning as if the conclusion were obvious. He never said leave. He didn't have to. The message was layered, repeated, normalized. That is how people convince themselves they are being reasonable while pushing someone out. One afternoon, he laid papers out on a sleek glass table and waved me over expense summaries, projections, charts meant to intimidate. He explained them slowly, carefully, as though I had never planned for anything in my life. He talked about costs, about sustainability, about how marriage meant shared priorities now. He framed it as concern, but his eyes told a different story. This wasn't about numbers, it was about authority. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he waited. He expected discomfort, resistance, maybe even fear. Instead, I thanked him for explaining and told him transparency was important. My calm unsettled him. For a moment, his confidence flickered. Then it returned stronger because he mistook restraint for surrender. Men like him always do. That night, alone in my room, I opened the leather folder again. I read every document slowly, deliberately. Deeds, trust structures, legal protections, the will. Everything was clear, everything was intact. Marriage had changed nothing, emotion had changed nothing. Control had never left my hands. The next morning I made several quiet calls, professional, precise. Conversations with people who knew exactly who I was and exactly what I controlled. No one explained things slowly to me, no one laughed, no one questioned my relevance. When the calls ended, I felt steady, reminded of something marriage and money often obscure. Authority isn't granted by relationships, it's earned through responsibility and preserved through preparation. He believed marrying my daughter had made him untouchable. He believed access had replaced accountability. He believed my silence meant acceptance. What he didn't realize was that silence was not the absence of action. It was the space where preparation happens, and the documents he had never asked about were already moving closer to the moment when his fantasy would collapse, not loudly, not cruelly, but completely, because marriage may open doors, but it does not erase ownership, and soon the documents would remind him of that truth. By the time the third week passed, his behavior was no longer subtle or experimental. The fantasy he had built around marriage had solidified into certainty. He no longer acted like someone testing boundaries, he acted like someone enforcing them. The house reflected that shift, not in its design or luxury, but in the way space was claimed, decisions were made, and silence was expected. He moved through the rooms with a sense of entitlement that no longer bothered pretending to be polite. At 74, I had learned that this stage is always the most dangerous, not because it is loud, but because it feels settled. People stop questioning themselves once they believe they are right. I noticed how deliberately I was being erased. When I entered a room, conversations continued without pause, as if my presence had no impact on the atmosphere. When I spoke, responses came delayed, shortened, or redirected. Sometimes he responded without looking at me at all. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, dismissal disguised as efficiency. In his mind, marriage had reclassified me from authority to obstacle, from foundation to inconvenience. The luxury of the house became a tool rather than a setting. He talked openly about reworking spaces, about converting rooms, about making the house flow better for our life now. He never asked for my input. He never acknowledged the history embedded in those walls. He spoke about the future constantly, but in every version of it I was absent, not removed suddenly, just gradually phased out like outdated furniture. One afternoon I returned from a walk to find boxes stacked neatly near the storage room. Some of them held items that had been in the house longer than he had known my daughter. Old books, framed documents. Personal effects moved quietly, efficiently, without discussion. When I asked about it, he smiled casually and said it made sense to organize things early. He said clarity prevents confusion later. What he meant was that clarity benefits those who decide first. My daughter noticed the boxes. I saw the conflict on her face, the hesitation before she spoke. She asked him gently if we should talk about it together. He dismissed the concern with a laugh and said it was just practical planning. He said everyone does this eventually. She looked at me then, eyes searching for a reaction. I gave none. Silence was no longer passive. It was strategic. Later that day, he called me into the living room. Sunlight flooded the space through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the glass table where papers were spread carefully, deliberately. Expense reports, forecasts, charts printed in neat rows. He gestured for me to sit and began explaining the numbers slowly, patiently, as though I had never planned beyond a single month in my life. He spoke about long-term sustainability, about shared priorities, about how marriage changes financial responsibility. His tone was calm, almost rehearsed, like someone who had practiced justification more than truth. He pointed out costs associated with the house. He mentioned efficiency. He talked about how independence becomes important at a certain age. He never said I was a burden. He didn't have to. The implication sat comfortably between us, supported by charts and daylight. He finished by saying he wanted everything to be clear and fair moving forward. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he waited, expecting discomfort, resistance, maybe even fear. Instead, I thanked him for explaining and told him transparency was important. The calm response unsettled him. I saw it briefly in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. Then it vanished, replaced by confidence because he mistook restraint for agreement. People like him always do. That night, my daughter came to me quietly. She stood near the doorway, arms crossed, exhaustion etched into her posture. She apologized without fully naming what she was apologizing for. She said he was under pressure, that marriage had changed things faster than expected, that he was trying to plan responsibly. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was. It was easier than telling her the truth, that I was not okay with being erased, but I was prepared for it. As days passed, the pressure intensified, not emotionally but structurally. Schedules were set without consulting me. Decisions were announced rather than discussed. He began speaking to me as if my agreement were assumed rather than requested. The fantasy he lived in no longer needed reinforcement. It had become his reality. That was when I understood something clearly. He didn't believe marrying my daughter gave him power temporarily. He believed it transferred power permanently. He believed the relationship itself overrode history, ownership, and intent. He believed I had already been reduced to a formality, someone to be managed quietly, respectfully, but firmly. One afternoon, alone in my room, I opened the leather folder again. I read every document carefully, line by line: deeds, trust provisions, legal safeguards, the will. Everything was intact. Nothing had changed. Marriage had altered emotions, not authority. The power he thought he had claimed had never been offered. He had built his certainty on proximity, not permission. The next morning, I made several calls, quiet ones, the kind that do not announce themselves, conversations with people who recognized my voice immediately and spoke to me with respect earned over decades. No one explained things slowly, no one spoke over me, no one laughed. When the calls ended, I felt steady, anchored, reminded of who I had always been. A few days later, he mentioned casually that a lawyer would be stopping by soon to formalize some things. He said it confidently, almost smugly, as if the meeting existed to cement his control. My daughter looked uneasy but said nothing. I said nothing either. Silence once again worked in my favor. That night, lying awake in a house filled with glass, light, and assumptions, I understood the truth completely. He believed marriage had made him untouchable. He believed silence meant surrender. He believed the story was already written. What he didn't realize was that authority is not rewritten by confidence or connection. It is confirmed by documentation. And the documents he had never asked about were already positioned to end his fantasy, not with anger, not with humiliation, but with reality standing exactly where it always had. The day the lawyer arrived, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Sunlight poured through the glass walls, reflecting off marble floors and polished surfaces, giving everything an unreal calm. That calm was deceptive. It was the kind that exists just before something permanent happens. My son-in-law greeted the lawyer with confidence, shaking his hand firmly, smiling like a man welcoming confirmation rather than scrutiny. He spoke easily, gesturing toward the living room as if he were hosting a meeting meant to formalize what he already believed was his. He did not look at me. In his mind, I had already been accounted for and dismissed. We sat in the open living space where wealth was designed to impress. He leaned back comfortably, arms crossed, posture relaxed, certain. My daughter sat beside him, stiff, her unease finally visible now that authority had entered the room in a form he did not control. I sat across from them, composed, hands resting calmly, my silence no longer defensive but deliberate. The lawyer placed his briefcase on the glass table and opened it slowly. The sound of metal clasps releasing cut through the room with more force than any raised voice ever could. The lawyer began reading in a neutral, measured tone: dates, transactions, property history. At first, my son-in-law barely listened. His gaze drifted to the windows, to the house itself, as if the walls would validate him. But as the reading continued, his posture changed. He leaned forward slightly. His smile faded. When the lawyer stated clearly that the property had been purchased outright decades earlier, my son-in-law laughed once, reflexively, the same laugh he had used whenever he believed himself untouchable. This time it sounded thin. There must be a misunderstanding, he said lightly. The lawyer did not respond. He continued reading: legal structures, ownership protections, conditions established long before marriage ever entered the picture. Each sentence dismantled another assumption my son-in-law had relied on. The air in the room grew heavy. My daughter's breathing changed. I heard it. She turned slowly toward me, disbelief breaking into realization. She looked at the documents, then at me. I met her eyes and nodded once. No explanation, no defense, just confirmation. My son-in-law interrupted, his voice sharper now, irritation replacing confidence. He said he would have known. He said this didn't make sense. The lawyer looked up briefly and explained calmly that assumptions do not alter legal reality. He resumed reading without hesitation. Then the will was introduced. The lawyer's tone remained steady as he outlined its terms: assets, intent, conditions, authority, the house, the absence of a name that fully expected to be there. The color drained from my son-in-law's face. His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since I had known him, he had nothing prepared, no dismissal, no leverage, no marriage to hide behind. My daughter stood abruptly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. She asked why I had never told her. I told her quietly that I wanted her life to be built on respect, not dependency, and that I never believed silence would be mistaken for weakness. Her expression shifted not into anger, but into understanding. She finally saw how the fantasy had been constructed and who it served. I stood then not to dominate the room, but to reclaim it. I spoke calmly, evenly, without emotion. I told him he had mistaken marriage for ownership and access for authority. I told him that relationships do not overwrite history and confidence does not rewrite documentation. I told him that respect is not granted by proximity, it is earned and preserved. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Truth, once documented, speaks clearly on its own. The lawyer closed the file. The sound echoed through the room, final and unmistakable. In that moment, the fantasy collapsed completely. The man who believed marriage had made him untouchable could no longer meet my eyes. Wealth, confidence, connection, none of it mattered anymore. Only reality remained, standing exactly where it always had, and for the first time since he married my daughter, he understood that the power he thought he held had never been his to claim. After the lawyer left, the house did not erupt into chaos the way movies suggest moments like that should. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations, no doors slammed in anger. Instead, a heavy, unfamiliar quiet settled over everything. The sunlight still poured through the glass walls, still reflected off marble floors and polished surfaces, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The luxury that once amplified his confidence now exposed its emptiness. Without the fantasy to support it, the house felt stripped down to truth. My son-in-law remained seated long after the meeting ended. The man who once walked through the house with entitlement now looked uncertain where to place himself. His shoulders were slumped, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees as if he no longer trusted his own movements. He did not look at me, he couldn't. The shield he believed marriage had given him was gone, and without it he stood exposed, not humiliated by me but undone by his own assumptions. My daughter stood near the window, staring out at the property she thought she understood. When she finally turned toward me, her expression was not anger, it was realization. She apologized quietly, not in a rush, not defensively, but with the weight of someone who finally understood the cost of silence. She apologized for not speaking sooner, for letting comfort replace courage, for believing peace could be maintained by looking away. I told her forgiveness didn't require explanation. Understanding had arrived, and that mattered more than any apology. Later that evening, when the house was quieter, my son-in-law asked to speak to me privately. His voice was different now, measured, careful, stripped of confidence. He talked about pressure, about responsibility, about how marrying into the family made him feel like he had to prove something. He admitted that he believed access meant authority, that marriage gave him standing he didn't have to earn. I listened without interrupting, not because his explanation mattered, but because listening no longer cost me anything. When he finished, I told him calmly that respect does not begin after consequences. It begins long before entitlement feels safe. Whether he learned that lesson was no longer my responsibility, life inside the house changed after that day, not loudly but completely. Conversations slowed, declarations disappeared. Decisions were no longer announced as facts but discussed as possibilities. He stopped assuming agreement and started asking questions. The man who once believed marriage made him untouchable now weighed his words carefully in my presence, not out of fear but out of awareness. Reality has a way of teaching restraint where arrogance once lived. In the weeks that followed, practical decisions were made quietly. No ultimatums, no forced endings. My daughter needed time to understand what her marriage looked like without illusion propping it up. I needed peace. For the first time in a long while, both were possible. I moved freely through the house again, no longer shrinking myself to maintain balance. Silence, when it came, belonged to me by choice, not necessity. I returned to my routines. Early mornings, coffee by the window as daylight filled the house. Walks across the property where every step reminded me of years spent building something meant to last. Neighbors greeted me the same way they always had, with respect that was never tied to wealth, marriage, or performance. Nothing outside had changed. Only the truth inside the house had finally been acknowledged. The documents were never about revenge. They were about clarity, about boundaries drawn long before they were tested, about reminding everyone, including myself, that authority is not transferred through relationships, charm, or confidence. It is established through responsibility and preserved through preparation. I did not raise my voice, I did not demand recognition. I allowed reality to speak where fantasy once lived. He thought marrying my daughter made him untouchable. He thought access replaced accountability. He thought silence meant surrender. What he learned instead was simple and permanent. Marriage may open doors, but it does not grant ownership. Connection may offer proximity, but it does not erase history. And confidence, no matter how loud, will always collapse when it meets documented truth. When the fantasy ended, nothing needed to be taken from him by force. Everything simply returned to where it had always belonged.